kind of a personal question on the emotional guidance scale. I don't think that I spend very much time anymore in fear, despair, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if you get that sense or not.
Well, it's a sliding scale that moves all the time. So what once was fear, once you hang around in really high frequency vibration, a little bit of resistance has the same visceral emotional feeling effect as, in other words, when your vibration is at its high side frustration, then even though the actual range of vibration to despair on the scale as compared to all vibrations might be very low, but the relative difference is what it is. It's the relative difference that we're always talking about, isn't it?
Yes,
so
you are.
The better you usually feel, then the worse the relative difference feels.
Okay. And I think that I've moved my relative scale in the last few years quite a bit.
Yes, we agree. But since there is no giant scale in the sky that is comparing all of the emotions that you've ever felt with all of the emotions that anyone else has felt,
right,
then it's pretty irrelevant, isn't it? In other words, the vortex keeps moving. The vortex keeps moving, and
true. And we have a relative
and really,
movement.
what the best emotion that you could ever find one is that one of confidence, of knowing that you can always stay on the brink or within the vortex. Yes.
Completely agree.
Yes.
At the same time, whether it's in your books or wherever, there is a relatively arbitrary or fixed, set of words, 24 of them or 22 or whatever. And so that is a pretty good benchmark that we do use to measure where we are. And I guess the one that I seem to have found a groove on, and I think it's at the bottom end of the range that I'm at, and maybe before it was at the top end, and I'd like you to expand on it more. And it's interesting because you used the words for the first time, I think, that I've heard you say them in your monologue a couple of times, which was irritation. And I seem to have a groove around kind of irritation or crankiness or impatience. And first off, I feel that pretty strongly as a place where I spend most of my time at the bottom of my scale. Is that something that you get the feeling, or is it?
Well, it is irritating. In other words, when you know that you are the creator of your own experience, and you know the laws of the universe, and you know about the existence of your vibrational escrow, mm-hmm. and you have a pretty keen sense of what's in there, and you're standing in a moment in time outside from that, that's what irritation is. In other words, we think that irritation may be the best word that could be fashioned to describe the friction of not allowing who you really are. In other words, Esther has a pair of shoes that she likes so much that when she discovered how good they felt the moment she put them on, she went right back to Nordstrom's and bought 3 more pair exactly like them, because she knows that these things come and go, and she didn't want to wait until they were worn to go find them, thinking that they might not be there. But she's been leaving her 3 fresh pair in the box, in the bus. They're under the sofa, all lined up, ready to go anytime she's ready. And each trip, she looks at her existing shoes and says, "You still look new, you still feel good." And she's been saying to Jerry, "These shoes are indestructible. I wear them all the time. They're almost the only thing that I'm ever wearing." And they are. And then the other day, while they were walking, Esther began to feel a little irritation on the back of her heel. And she realized that that shoe was worn thin, and there was a piece of it now that was touching her in a way that it had not done before. A very minor irritation, a sort of friction rubbing against. Now, here's the thing about that minor irritation. In other words, if in the moment that you feel it, you stop and change the shoe or do something about it, it does not become more irritating. It does not become more acute. But irritation is what it feels like when something is out of alignment within you. Mm-hmm. And we say, put up with no minor irritation and it won't become more. So the question that we want to put back to you is, don't you think that it is appropriate in the same way Esther does not feel that something has gone terribly wrong, that this shoe did not have an eternal lifespan? In other words, she's really pleased with how well wearing these shoes have been. And we would like you to sort of adopt the same thing. We want you to feel not angry at yourself or irritated for your irritation. We want you to say, this is a natural consequence of something wearing thin. Something is out of alignment. Something that I've been focused upon for a while is not in alignment with what I'm really wanting and who I really am. And in the same simple, in other words, Esther will just move those shoes out of her life and move some others in, just like you could move whatever thought it is that's irritating you out of your life and move some other thought in. Really, that's all there is to it.
Well, I guess when, again, when others take actions, let's say, or it could be me, but it's usually others, that previously would have made me very angry. Again, it just seems almost as if the irritation it's in response to the same action, the same external stimulus, but it just seems much more measured and much milder than the anger that had been there before. But it seems like that's a bit of a floor in terms of where my emotional range will be in response to that sort of thing. And I suppose it's progress over anger. I forget where irritation is on the scale compared to it, but I think it's above anger. But I'm wondering...
Anger, we would say despair is here, and anger is here, and irritation, disappointment is here, and fear is further, almost as far as disempowerment, and that irritation is like frustration. It's somewhere between anger and frustration. That's where we'd put it.
And is that something that's well below hope? I guess one question is, I think that you've said in the past, when you've been talking to people about physical conditions, that there are illnesses or physical conditions that are related to where you spend a lot of time on the emotional guidance scale. And I'm kind of curious, what goes along with irritation? Irritation
is compatible with self-inflicted traumas, like cutting yourself while you shave, stubbing your toe, bending your fingernail back, things that are not devastating but just irritating.
Okay. Any thoughts on how to get past? Again, it just feels for me like this is on the way up the scale, just a bit of a sticking point or like a groove in the road.
But we haven't come to something that's really the most essential part of this conversation, and that is, once you've understood emotions as you have, and once you have deliberately and rather successfully held yourself in a place of feeling quite good for a sustainable period of time, we're talking about a few weeks even. What happens when irritation returns is that, let's start in this place, you're really going to like this. You've heard us say many times that the contrast causes you to ask for more, and when you turn and find alignment with it, now you get the manifestation of what you're asking for, and you also get a new platform from which to ask. So there have been many moments of much stronger than irritation that has put things into your vibrational escrow that you then lined up with, because frankly, when you are really feeling despair, there is a stronger motivation or intentionality on your part to do something about it. Where irritation, sometimes you're not as prudent about getting on it as fast. In other words, most people will put up with things that are just annoying or irritating, where if there's something that's really bothering you, you'll do the vibrational work more. So as a result, now stay with us on this story that we've been telling. So contrast caused you to ask for more, you lined up with it, and it manifested. Now a new set of contrasting experiences causes you to ask for more, you lined up with it, and it manifests. Now a new set of experiences causes you to ask for more, you lined up with it, and you received it. So now what's happened along this emotional scale that we won't say is a giant emotional scale in the sky, except for just this one time, as we're saying. So let's say you've moved yourself up this emotional scale so that your set point is really up here in this place where you're usually feeling confident and secure and interested and elated and joyful and appreciative and passionate, and now you're feeling some irritation. The irritation itself is a byproduct of how well you've moved up this scale. It's a byproduct of how many times you've closed the gap, how many times you've closed the gap, how many times you've closed the gap. In other words, when you keep closing the gap and closing the gap and closing the gap, we would say pretty steady irritation is really an indicator of someone who is really fine-tuning their experience.
So this is a good thing. Irritation is a good thing.
It's a good thing because it lets you know that you have progressed into a place that is more evolved in terms of vibration than almost anybody you will ever meet, but still you have this relative gap between who you've become and who you're letting yourself be. In other words, there's something sort of nice. Esther has been enjoying her irritations because she's become a focus wheel fanatic. So, meaning that she wants to do focus wheels anytime there's a little irritation that shows up, because there's something so empowering about soothing the irritation. The indication that irritation is indicating is, I've expanded further than I'm allowing. And that's irritating. I've expanded further than I'm allowing. Ooh, some work to do. What can I do to soothe the irritation? Just know there's always going to be a little irritation because there's always going to be a step one experience. So when you live with it and you call it irritation, not unworthiness, you call it irritation, which means adventure, not irritation, which means problem. In other words, it's all in the mindset that you have about it. Okay. And you're right. We picked up on the irritation in your vibration, and it's why we talked about it as we did. It's not that irritation is new, but it's from a new vantage point that you are considering it.
Okay, so, I think things actually are going quite well for me in general. And I'm sorry?
We want to interrupt here just briefly because you said, I noticed that the irritation arises usually when someone else does something. In other words, It's usually someone else's behavior that is irritating to me. And we want you to feel that just for a moment. Feel that irritation that is present when someone else does something. And then just ask yourself, is this irritation going to move into powerlessness as I realize I can't control their experience? Or is it just this irritation that they are aggravating something that now I want to focus upon and tend to in a more powerful way? In other words, the irritation is pointing right at my next satisfying progression.
Okay, I guess when I think about it, I would put it in slightly different terms, which is I kind of have a vision, or I see or I feel how I want things to go in any number of areas, and it's like, oh, what are you doing bringing this up that is,
Well, so this is the thing that we want you to hear. Your irritation is not with them or what they're doing. Your irritation is with the discord. In other words, that's what you're just saying. What are you doing here? I thought I'd worked you out. What are you doing here? I thought I'd worked you out. And we want you to stop saying that. We want you to realize that there's always going to be something to work out. So if you bless the slightness of the irritation in relationship to the severity of the disempowerment, now the irritation works for you, not against you. For example, this is a very hot stove. That's incredibly irritating. But isn't it a good thing? Because if the irritation weren't there, then there could be absence of awareness and a tremendous amount of detrimental experience could be received before appropriate response from you. So, irritation, how about such sensitivity that stove is hot? How do you know? I feel the irritation. Oh, that's not irritation, that's just warmth. Get closer. Okay. I feel the irritation. No, that's not irritation, that's just warmth. That's irritation. Ooh. To what degree, how far do I dare go with this irritation? In other words, isn't everything like that? You get to decide. You and only you get to decide at what point. There are some people who push themselves 1, 2, 3, 4, further than others. In other words, if we were standing in your physical shoes, we would bless the sensitivity and we would call it irritation.
Okay, so I get that, and this answers a big question, which is I was concerned that irritation was the thing, kind of an impediment that was keeping me away from, let's call it the vortex. And you're saying no, it's actually
well,
an indicator.
What about this? What about irritation from which you offer no change? In other words, if something irritates you and you just feel irritated and you don't strive for the relief of the irritation, then in other words, you can't stand still. You're either moving toward more irritation or less irritation at all times.
Right.